Hi everyone, welcome to this video about writing stories for creative writing or imaginative writing. And the focus of this video is about getting ideas. Actually, what are you going to write about? Because the task that you get in that exam you won't have seen before. And you've got 45 minutes or so to write your story. And you can't be spending an hour thinking of an idea. You've got to get going as soon as possible. So this video is all about trying to get some ideas related to a particular task. Just to start with some advice, and of course across all exam boards and specifications there is going to be a story element. So this is not just specific to a particular exam board, this is for any exam board which is assessing GCSE English Language. So this is the advice that I give my students every single year, and the first piece of advice is to recycle your story ideas. What that means is that you will have written stories as homework, stories in class, stories for mock exams within the year of your, this year, the academic year. And the examiner doesn't know anything about those because that is something that your school and teachers organise themselves without any contact with the exam board at all. So if you have written a good story back in October or November, for example, for homework, then recycle that idea. There's no reason why you can't use those ideas. And you might find the question you get in the exam fits perfectly with a story that you've written at some point in your school or college year. So please feel free to recycle your ideas, use them more than once. Also think about any books or images or films or documentaries or TV shows that you have watched or read recently, and that can also inspire you in terms of a plot or something that happens. So think of anything that you have watched or read recently which you might be able to adapt into an idea. Keep dialogue to a minimum. So dialogue can be difficult to write. You have to sometimes play around with speech marks and punctuation with dialogue. Even published writers say that dialogue is very hard to write effectively. And what you don't want to be doing is spending 45 minutes writing a transcript, because it's very easy to get bogged down in writing lots and lots of conversations between characters, and while that happens, you're not describing anything and you're also not telling a story, you're just writing dialogue. So my advice to students would be to keep dialogue to a minimum. Also to keep characters to a minimum as well. So I would say to students no more than 2 or 3 characters. You have to remember that you are writing, let's say, a 45-minute story or up to an hour. And as a result of that, there is only so much you can do. And what you can't do is end up trying to write a trilogy or a Dickens novel that has 100 characters. It's just not possible in the time. So keep characters to a minimum as well as dialogue as well. Remember that even though you are doing a story, there is still going to be a descriptive element to it, because you have to describe the setting, you have to describe how characters are feeling, you have to describe what happens and what the characters look like. So there is still a descriptive element as well. Also, don't feel obligated to finish your story. Sometimes a task will be write the opening of a short story, which means that they're not expecting you to finish. Sometimes students rush because they feel they have to finish the story, and as a result of that they compromise some of the details. So even if you don't get finished, they will still credit you with what you have written up to that point. Realise that the task that they will give you will be very open-ended and subjective, which means that it can be interpreted in a number of different ways, and that's deliberate because they want people to write different stories. They don't want everyone to write the same story. So people will interpret the task in numerous ways to help your imagination, really, and to help your creativity. So everyone should not be writing the same story. And finally, keep it simple. Like I said, you've only got 45 minutes to an hour for this. You're not going to be able to write a novel. So the plot, your story idea, has to be simple as possible. And they tend to work best in the context of this task. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you 4 short story examples or tasks that have come up, and then for each of those tasks to give you 4 examples of what your story could be about. So this first task came up in the November retake of 2022. Write a story about an unlikely friendship. And around the outside you can see we've got 4 possible ideas, which you would have to elaborate on, of course, if you were going to choose this idea. So one idea could be 2 children from rival families become friends on their first day of school. Bit of an influence there from Romeo and Juliet, perhaps. Another story idea could be someone discovers a stray dog on the street and decides to adopt it, so the friendship here is not between 2 humans, but between animals and humans. Another idea could be a child and an elderly lady strike up a friendship after the boy finds the lady's purse on a bus, and the friendship takes place because the lady is maybe quite lonely, and the boy wants to be friends with her because maybe the lady reminds him of his grandmother or something. And finally, someone whose wallet was stolen becomes friends with the thief. So the unlikely friendship there is the victim of the crime becoming friends with the perpetrator of the crime. So 4 examples there of a story idea linked to that central task. Another idea could be, or another task you get could be to do with a theme like conflict. And again, conflict might not be a war zone or just about a war zone. Conflict can exist in everyday life between 2 or more things. So here, a girl has a fight with her mother and runs away, and the story is, will she ever return, and is she okay? Another story idea related to conflict is a teenage boy is encouraged by his friends to commit a crime, but the boy isn't sure whether he wants to, and therefore the conflict is between right and wrong, or legal and illegal. Another idea here to do with the conflict between prejudice and acceptance, perhaps. A white child with racist parents becomes friends with a black child. Very similar to the idea in The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas, perhaps, there, if you've read that. Or, again, to do with conflict, a woman tries to escape the house of her abusive boyfriend. Will she manage it? Will she be okay? And clearly the conflict there is between the 2 characters. And there are other ideas as well. You could set your story in a war zone, for example, and your story could be about refugees or escaping a concentration camp or something. So, conflict isn't just about fighting. Conflict can also be about emotions and our relationships with others. Another idea could be write a story about a time you felt incredibly happy, and sometimes the theme or the task you get will be a personal emotion like this. You don't have to be honest. You don't have to write about yourself. You could make it up. So here, after 2 children go missing in a forest, they are safely returned home. So the parents perhaps incredibly happy that they were returned to them. You could write a story which plays about with time. So your story doesn't always have to be set in one time frame or 1 year. It could be set across numerous years or even decades. So you could write a story, for example, which is about a happy childhood, and that happy childhood is made up of lots of different vignettes or moments of happiness. So the child remembers playing in the park, going on a night out with friends, first kiss, etc. So you could play about with time across numerous decades or years. You write a story about an artifact that was lost, that was returned to you safe and sound, like a watch or a ring or a necklace or a photograph or a picture. Or you could think about someone being plagued by memories of a long-lost sibling, and after years and years of not knowing where the sibling is in the world, a man finally is reunited with his sister after 40 years, and of course that would make him, I would think, feel incredibly happy as well as the sister. So again, 4 ways you could interpret that central task there, and of course there would be others. And finally, write a story set in a remote place, remote meaning empty and lonely and isolated. So you could write a story about where mysterious noises are heard in a pub in the Scottish Highlands. You could write a story about a man trying to stay alive after his plane crashes on a remote island in the Pacific. That was inspired by William Golding's Lord of the Flies. And there's another novel that he wrote as well called Pincher Martin, which is quite a good novel about a man being marooned on this island. You might write a story about 3 teenagers who go exploring in an abandoned prison, only to find they can't find the way out. There's lots of videos actually on YouTube about people exploring abandoned places. And they're quite interesting actually to see how time can be just locked in the past. It's really quite spooky, some of the videos. So again, YouTube of course can also be a good source of inspiration for videos and for plots and stories. And finally, a man remembers his long lost wife as he sits under a tree in the middle of the countryside. So the remote countryside there hits the criteria of that task. So the thing is to go into that exam to have some story ideas perhaps ready to go, to be able to pull them off the shelf or get them off the shelf and use them, or have maybe 5 ideas in your head that you can then easily tweak to whatever the task is. So finally, in terms of how to plan, you are encouraged to spend about 5 minutes planning. And for a story, of course, you need to think about your structure of your story. So what is the beginning, what is the middle, what is the end, and how it all flows together. So your plan could be something like this, bullet points, if you wanted to, just helping you figure out what you're going to be talking about in each section of the story. So if I was going to use the idea of the man thinking about his long lost wife under the tree in the countryside, this might be my plan. I start my story with a flashback to 1960, when the man and woman were married when they were young, aged 18. As we move into the middle, I would want to talk about the present day, describing the man, how he feels maybe, what he's wearing, describing the countryside where he's walking, and how he's thinking about memories of the past and how his wife died in 2004. And how he's kind of feeling about this now that he's in this place where they visited together. It's quite melancholic. And the end, something along the lines of the man sits under a willow tree by a river, he twists his wedding ring in his fingers that he's still wearing, and the last thing that I say is something like the scent of the wildflowers has replaced the perfume of his wife, something like that. So it's quite a sad story, but sad stories sometimes make good stories, as I'm sure you are aware. So that could be your plan. It's just making sure you know exactly what you're saying in each section of your story. And each of those could be a paragraph. 3 paragraphs, doesn't have to be, but 3 paragraphs, 15 minutes per paragraph. So the real thing here is to just make sure you're planning and making sure that you know the direction of your story. Okay, so that video was all about writing stories for GCSE and making sure that you have ideas that you can then use in your exam. Thank you.